She smiled when she handed me the fine. $350,000 for a garden fence. I asked her to show me the property line. She laughed and said the board doesn't explain itself. 6 months later, everything she loved was gone, because she never once asked who I really was. My name is Marcus Doyle, 38 years old, a land surveyor who spends most days measuring other people's boundaries instead of drawing attention to my own life. I live quietly with my wife Elena and our daughter in a modest brick two-story on Larkspur Lane, in a subdivision called Willowbrook Ridge, on the edge of a small Ohio town. We bought the house 2 years ago after my father passed, mostly because it reminded Elena of the farmhouse she grew up in. I never told the neighbors much about my background. I just wanted a normal life, mowing the lawn on Saturdays, coaching my daughter's soccer team, nodding hello at the mailbox like everyone else. Willowbrook Ridge had one thing everyone warned me about before I signed the closing papers. Its homeowners association. People joked about it at the hardware store, rolling their eyes the moment I mentioned the street name. "Good luck with Vivian," the cashier said, like she was naming a weather pattern instead of a woman. Vivian Hargrove had been HOA president for 11 years. She wasn't elected so much as she was unopposed, year after year, because nobody wanted the headache of running against her. She had a talent for making silence feel like agreement, and agreement feel like loyalty. The first time I met her, she was standing in my driveway measuring my mailbox post with a tape measure, muttering about regulation height. I introduced myself, offered her lemonade. She looked at my work boots and clipboard and decided, on the spot, that I was beneath a conversation. Elena warned me not to make waves. She'd already heard stories from the Petersons 2 doors down, who'd been fined $400 for a wind chime that disrupted the acoustic harmony of the cul-de-sac. I laughed it off. I thought petty rules were the worst Willowbrook Ridge had to offer. Our property backed onto a shallow creek. 4 acres total, most of it wooded, the kind of land you buy for privacy, not proximity. My father had specifically told me, before he died, to hold onto land near water. He never explained why. I assumed it was sentiment, not strategy. I didn't know yet that 4 acres of creekside land in a growing town like ours was the kind of thing developers circled like hawks. I didn't know Vivian had already had 2 closed-door meetings with a company called Cross Creek Resorts about expansion opportunities along that very creek. What I did know was that our HOA dues had jumped twice in 2 years, with no clear explanation on the newsletter beyond necessary infrastructure investment. Elena asked about it at a meeting once. Vivian smiled and said numbers were board business, not resident business, and moved on to the next agenda item. I let it go, the way most people let things go, because fighting City Hall over a rounding error felt exhausting and small. What I didn't understand yet was that Vivian collected small surrenders the way other people collected stamps. Every time someone backed down, she filed it away as proof she could go further. My daughter, Ruby, started a little vegetable garden that spring behind our fence line, near the tree row that marked where our land met the community's shared walking trail. It was 8 tomato plants and a row of sunflowers. She was proud of it. Every morning. Vivian drove past that garden almost daily on her walks with her small white dog, Chauncey, who yipped at anything that moved. I noticed her slow down near our fence a few times, studying the sunflowers like they'd personally offended her sense of order. I thought nothing of it. In hindsight, that was the moment the file on us started. Vivian didn't confront people directly if she could help it. She built cases first, quietly, the way a prosecutor builds an indictment before an arrest. Ruby's sunflowers, my garage's unapproved paint shade, our mailbox, all of it went into a folder with my name on it. I found out only later that Vivian kept folders on almost every homeowner she considered a future problem. Some were thin, apparently filled up fast, because I asked questions at meetings instead of nodding along. And questions, to Vivian, were the first symptom of rebellion. The second thing that put me on her radar was simpler and dumber than anyone would guess. I corrected her once, gently, in front of other homeowners, about a county zoning statute she'd misquoted to justify a fine against another family. I was right, in front of. "You're a surveyor, not a lawyer," she told me afterward, in a tone that made clear she considered both professions equally beneath her opinion of herself. I apologized for embarrassing her publicly, which was a mistake, because Vivian read apologies as confessions, not courtesies. By early summer, the HOA newsletter mentioned a comprehensive property review scheduled for the fall, meant to ensure full compliance across all lots. Most residents groaned and forgot about it within a day. I remember Elena joking that our sunflowers better watch their backs. We laughed. The first real skirmish came on a Tuesday morning in July, when a certified letter arrived citing me for an unauthorized structure encroaching on common area land, the 8-foot cedar fence I'd built the year before, following the exact plat lines given to me at closing. The letter demanded I remove the fence within 30 days or face a review board hearing. I called the HOA office, professional, asking which specific boundary marker they were using. The woman on the phone said all disputes had to go through Vivian directly. Of course they did. I met Vivian at the property line with my own certified survey plat in hand, the one I'd stamped myself as part of my job. She barely glanced at it. "Our surveyor uses different reference points," she said, as if boundary lines were a matter of personal taste rather than recorded fact. "Your surveyor turned out to be a man named Gary Pruitt, a semi-retired county inspector who did side work for Vivian's board and, coincidentally, golfed with her husband every Thursday. I didn't know that detail yet. I only knew his measurements moved my fence line 11 feet onto my own land. I showed Vivian, calmly, that 11 feet placed the violation not on common ground, but squarely inside a boundary that had been mine since the original 1987 plat recording, decades before Willowbrook Ridge even had an HOA. She said the board would take that under advisement and walked away. 3 days later, a second letter arrived, no longer about the fence alone. It now cited the garden shed, Ruby's sunflower bed, and a pattern of non-compliant landscaping that the review board considered a material threat to community cohesion. The fine attached, $4,000, payable in 14 days. Elena's hands shook reading it. $4,000 wasn't ruinous for us, but it wasn't nothing either, and the wording felt designed to frighten, not correct. I told her not to worry, that this was clearly a misunderstanding I could resolve with paperwork and patience. I believed that, at the time, I requested the official meeting minutes where this fine was approved, as HOA bylaws required. It took 3 weeks and 2 follow-up emails to receive them. When they finally arrived, the vote was listed as unanimous. 5 board members in favor. I later learned 2 of those 5 hadn't attended that meeting at all. I mentioned this discrepancy to Denise Okafor, a soft-spoken board member who lived on Maple Court and had always struck me as the only one asking real questions during meetings. She went quiet, glanced toward the door, and said only, "Be careful what you put in writing to her." That warning stuck with me more than the fine itself. Denise wasn't a dramatic woman. She measured her words like currency. If she was telling me to be careful, it meant she'd already seen what happened to people who weren't. I paid the $4,000 under protest, in writing, specifically to avoid escalation while I figured out how the encroachment claim had legs at all. Elena wanted to fight it immediately. I told her patience was a strategy too. I didn't yet understand that patience. With Vivian, read as weakness. Within a week of that payment, a new letter arrived. The garden was no longer just non-compliant. It was now labeled a hazardous, unpermitted agricultural structure, requiring full removal and site restoration, quoted at an estimate of $12,000, payable to a landscaping company that, I'd later learn, Vivian's nephew owned. I started keeping my own file that week, photographing everything, the fence, the garden, the original plat, every letter, every email. Elena thought I was being paranoid. I told her that, in my job, the person with the better documentation always wins. Eventually. I didn't know yet how long eventually would take. Vivian escalated in a way that felt almost theatrical, scheduling a special compliance hearing open to the entire neighborhood, framing me publicly as the reason dues might rise again due to necessary legal enforcement costs. She wanted an audience. She wanted the neighborhood to watch someone else get punished, so no one else would test her. At that hearing, held in the clubhouse, she controlled the booking calendar for. I brought my certified plat, my correspondence file, and copies of the county's actual zoning map. Vivian didn't let me speak until the very end of a 90-minute meeting, after most residents had already left, exhausted and bored. When I finally presented my documents, she interrupted twice, then announced the board would review my submission at an undetermined future date. No vote was taken publicly. I left that meeting understanding, for the first time, that this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a system built by one woman, for one purpose, control. Ruby cried the night we told her the sunflowers might have to come down. She was 9 years old and didn't understand zoning law, only that something she'd grown with her own hands was suddenly a hazard. Elena held her while I sat in the garage, staring at survey stakes, trying not to feel small. That was the moment something shifted in me. I'd spent my whole career respecting boundary lines, other people's land, other people's rules. I decided, staring at Ruby's tear-streaked face, that I would learn exactly how far Vivian's rules actually reached, and exactly where they stopped meaning anything at all. I requested Willowbrook Ridge's founding documents from the county recorder's office, the original declaration of covenants filed when the subdivision was built in 1988. Most homeowners never read these documents. I read land records for a living. I wanted to see, in ink, what powers the HOA legally held over my 4 acres. The clerk who pulled the file for me squinted at the folder before handing it over. "Haven't seen anyone request this one in years," she said. I didn't think much of the comment then. I would think about it constantly. Later, once I understood exactly why nobody ever asked, the declaration was dense. Decades of amendments stapled together. But one clause caught my eye immediately. All declarant rights, meaning ultimate authority over amendments, enforcement, and common area designation, were reserved to the original developer, a company called Ridgeline Capital Partners, unless formally and completely transferred to the homeowner-elected board. I searched for the transfer document. There wasn't one. Ridgeline Capital Partners ever formally relinquishing declarant control to the HOA board. Vivian now ran like a personal fiefdom. On paper, whoever controlled Ridgeline still held final legal say over every fine, every boundary, every rule in Willowbrook Ridge. I didn't recognize the name Ridgeline Capital Partners at first. It meant nothing to me. Just letters on old paperwork from a company that presumably folded decades ago. The way small development firms often do once their subdivisions sell out. I filed the detail away and kept reading, more out of habit than hope. Meanwhile, Vivian wasn't waiting on my research. A new letter arrived declaring the review board had unanimously upheld the $12,000 restoration fine, plus an additional penalty for failure to comply within the compliance window, bringing the total demand to $19,000, due within 10 business days or a lien would be filed. 10 business days. The attorney, a young man named Chris Ambrose, who sounded uncomfortable the moment I mentioned my case number. I just handle filings, he said carefully. Any questions about the underlying decisions go through the board president directly. Everyone, seemed, had been trained to point at Vivian and nowhere else. I asked Elena to start recording our interactions. Video where legal, audio where not, dates and times logged obsessively. She thought I was overreacting until Vivian showed up unannounced at our door one evening, Chauncey yapping at her heels, demanding to inspect our unpermitted rain barrels, while photographing our windows for reasons she never explained. "You're documenting everything I do," she said. Not quite a question, studying my phone propped visibly on the porch railing. "Just being thorough," I answered, the way she'd once described her own fines to me. Her jaw tightened. Word. But I felt, for the first time, that she was rattled. Denise Okafor called me that same week. Her voice low, almost a whisper. "She's telling other board members you're building a legal case against the association," Denise said. "She wants a vote to suspend your community privileges, pool, clubhouse, trail access, pending your fine payment." I hadn't broken a single rule. It didn't matter. The suspension passed 3 days later, 5-0, with Denise abstaining, the only dissent she felt safe enough to register. Ruby couldn't use the community pool that Saturday. She stood at the locked gate in her swimsuit, confused, while other kids splashed past the fence, and asked me why we were being punished. I didn't have a good answer for a 9-year-old. I had a growing folder of documents, a strange company name on an old land filing, and a slow, cold certainty that Vivian Hargrove had mistaken me for someone with no leverage at all, simply because I never once mentioned my father. My father, Robert Doyle, had died 8 months before we bought the house on Larkspur Lane, after a long illness that left most of his affairs to me to untangle. He'd been a quiet man too, a former commercial land developer who'd sold most of his active business interests decades ago. Or so I believed. Among his papers, boxed and mostly unopened in my garage, was a thick manila folder labeled simply Ridgeline, Willowbrook. I remembered seeing it during the estate settlement and assuming it referred to some abandoned project from the 80s, one of a dozen ventures my father tried before settling into semi-retirement. I hadn't opened it. That night, after Ruby's pool humiliation, I finally did. Inside were founding incorporation papers for Ridgeline Capital Partners, dated 1987, listing Robert Doyle as sole managing member. Attached was a subdivision plat for a development called Willowbrook Ridge. My father hadn't just worked on this land decades ago. He'd built it. I sat on the garage floor for nearly an hour, papers spread across my knees, feeling the shape of the last 2 years rearrange itself entirely. I hadn't randomly bought a house in a random subdivision. Some quiet, buried instinct, or maybe fate, or maybe my father's old realtor friend nudging the listing my way, had brought me home. I called my father's longtime attorney, Harold Feynman, the next morning, my hands unsteady on the phone. Did Ridgeline Capital ever formally transfer its declarant rights over Willowbrook Ridge to the Homeowners Association? I asked, trying to keep my voice level. There was a long pause before Harold answered. Your father always meant to, Harold said slowly. But after your mother passed, he kind of stopped dealing with that file entirely. Legally, unless something's changed I don't know about, Ridgeline still holds it. And Ridgeline dissolved into your name, along with everything else, the day probate closed. I asked him to say that again. Plainly, no legal hedging. Harold confirmed it without hesitation. I was, as of 8 months ago, the sole owner of Ridgeline Capital Partners, and therefore held ultimate declarant authority over the very HOA that had just locked my daughter out of a public pool. I didn't tell Elena that night. I told myself I needed to verify everything first. Quietly, the way you'd confirm a survey before staking new boundary markers. But really, I think some part of me wanted to sit with the knowledge alone for a while, turning it over like a stone in my pocket. The next morning, I drove to the county recorder's office again, this time asking specifically for every amendment ever filed against the Willowbrook Ridge Declaration since 1988. There were 14 amendments. Every single one required declarant sign-off under Section 4, Subsection 2. Every single one had been signed instead only by HOA board officers. In other words, every fine, every rule change, every special assessment Vivian's board had ever passed in over a decade was potentially unenforceable, procedurally void from the moment it was filed, because the one signature the law actually required had never once been sought or given. Not my signature. And mine. I didn't march over and announce this immediately. 12 years of watching land disputes taught me that the person holding the strongest legal position wins by being patient, not loud. I wanted to see exactly how far Vivian would go before I revealed what she'd actually built her entire kingdom on top of. Meanwhile, the lien against my property for the unpaid $19,000 fine was formally filed at the county courthouse, a public record now attached to my land. Neighbors started treating us differently at the mailbox. A few sympathetic glances, a few sideways looks, as if fines were contagious and I was patient zero. Elena noticed the shift first. The Petersons stopped waving. A woman down the street pulled her kids away from Ruby at the bus stop one morning, murmuring something about the family causing all that trouble with the HOA. Vivian had been busy narrating our story before we ever got a chance to. I finally told Elena everything that weekend, laying my father's ridgeline papers across our kitchen table like evidence in a trial. She read them twice, silent, then looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite name, somewhere between disbelief, relief, and something sharper, hungrier, that I'd never seen in her before. So legally, she said slowly, none of this, the fines, the pool ban, any of it was ever actually enforceable. I nodded. Then why, she asked, are we sitting here letting her humiliate our daughter? I didn't have a good answer, only a plan I hadn't finished building yet. I wanted proof beyond paperwork, something undeniable, something that would matter even to people inclined to defend Vivian out of habit or fear. I started attending every HOA meeting after that, silent, recording, watching her operate up close, cataloging every irregularity the way I'd catalog erosion patterns along an unstable riverbank. What I found wasn't just procedural sloppiness. Meeting minutes were altered after the fact. Vote counts didn't match attendance sign-in sheets. 2 board members, listed as present for critical votes, hadn't attended a meeting in over a year. According to the sign-in logs I compared against the recorded minutes myself. I mentioned this quietly to Denise, who by then trusted me enough to speak more openly. She keeps blank signature pages, Denise admitted, barely above a whisper in the clubhouse parking lot. Adds names after the vote if she needs the numbers. I've seen her do it twice. I was too scared to say anything. I asked Denise why she stayed on the board at all, given what she clearly suspected. Her answer stuck with me. Because someone honest has to be in the room, she said. Even if all I can do is watch and remember. I told her that was about to matter more than she knew. The lien on my property triggered a required notice period before foreclosure proceedings could even theoretically begin. A slow legal clock designed to protect homeowners from exactly the kind of rushed, punitive action Vivian seemed determined to take. She didn't wait for the clock. She moved faster than the law technically allowed. A letter arrived announcing a special assessment against my property specifically, citing extraordinary enforcement and legal costs tied to my case, quoted at an additional $300,000 on top of the existing $19,000 fine, bringing the total demand against my family to roughly $319,000. I read the number twice before it landed. $319,000 for a fence, a garden, and 8 sunflowers, assessed by a woman who had never once shown me a legally valid survey supporting her original claim. The letter gave us 45 days before the HOA would initiate foreclosure action against our home. Elena's face went pale reading it. She can't actually do this, she said. More question than statement. I told her the truth. On paper, using the illusion of authority she'd built for over a decade, Vivian absolutely believed she could, and probably had done something similar before to families with less patience or fewer resources than us. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with my father's old Ridgeline folder, the county's 14 invalid amendments, Denise's quiet confession about forged signatures, and a slowly forming understanding that Vivian Hargrove had spent a decade ruling a kingdom built entirely on paperwork she never checked closely enough to fear. For 2 weeks after the special assessment letter, things went strangely quiet. No new fines. Vivian even nodded politely at the community mailbox one morning, the first civil gesture she'd offered in months. I recognized the pattern immediately because I'd seen it before in land disputes, quiet before pressure. I used the lull to keep building my case rather than relaxing into it. I requested certified copies of every board resolution passed in the last 3 years, citing my rights as a homeowner under the declaration itself. The HOA's office stalled, delayed, cited administrative backlog, but state law gave me leverage to eventually force compliance. Harold Feynman, my father's attorney, agreed to formally represent Ridgeline Capital Partners' interests going forward, working quietly in the background while I continued gathering evidence. Once we file, he warned me, there's no undoing it. She'll know exactly who you are, and exactly what that means for her. I told him I was ready. Ruby's pool privileges were quietly restored during this lull. No explanation given, which I now understood as Vivian testing whether small kindness might soften our resolve before the real deadline arrived. Ruby didn't know any of the legal maneuvering happening around her. She just splashed happily, relieved, unaware her family's entire future briefly hung on paperwork. Elena and I used the quiet weeks to reconnect with neighbors carefully. Not to build an army yet, just to understand who else Vivian had wronged. We learned the Petersons' wind chime fine had ballooned similarly, though they'd caved and sold their house at a steep loss rather than fight her. A retired teacher named Walter Combs mentioned, almost in passing at the mailbox, that Vivian had fined him 2 years earlier for a non-conforming mailbox post, then quietly purchased his house through a shell company months after he moved away, reselling it 18 months later for nearly double what he'd been forced to accept. I started noticing a pattern emerging from these small, scattered stories. Families fined into exhaustion, property values suppressed by manufactured violations, then quiet purchases through entities that traced back, with a little digging, to addresses connected to Vivian's husband, a real estate broker named Ted Hargrove. Ted Hargrove's name appeared on 3 separate LLCs registered at the county clerk's office, each owning at least one home previously fined by his wife's HOA board. I stared at that overlap for a long time, understanding finally why Vivian fought so hard, so specifically, over properties bordering the creek. Cross Creek Resorts. The same developer whose name appeared in board meeting notes Denise had quietly photographed for me, had submitted a preliminary rezoning inquiry to the county 8 months earlier, expressing interest in waterfront recreational development along exactly the stretch of creek my 4 wooded acres happened to border. Suddenly, the sunflower fine, the fence dispute, the mailbox obsession, all of it stopped looking like random pettiness and started looking like something closer to a campaign, deliberately aimed at devaluing and eventually seizing waterfront land Vivian Hargrove needed cleared before a resort deal could move forward on paper. I brought this theory to Harold, laying out property records, LLC filings, and Denise's whispered testimony side by side. He exhaled slowly. Up, he said. You're not looking at a homeowner squabble anymore. You're looking at organized fraud against an entire neighborhood, hiding behind an HOA badge. We decided to wait before confronting Vivian directly, gathering just enough additional proof to make any denial impossible. I photographed survey stakes again, this time bringing an independent, licensed surveyor with no ties to the county's inspection office. Someone who owed Gary Pruitt nothing and Vivian even less. The independent survey confirmed exactly what I'd suspected from the beginning. My fence sat precisely on the boundary established by the original 1987 plat, the very plat my father had filed under Ridgeline Capital Partners. There was no encroachment. There never had been. Only on paper Vivian controlled. Elena asked me, during one of our quiet late-night planning sessions, whether I felt any hesitation about what was coming. I told her the truth, to be a misunderstanding, resolvable with an apology and a torn-up fine. The evidence made that increasingly, painfully impossible to believe. The lull ended abruptly on a Thursday morning, when a sheriff's deputy arrived at our door with formal notice of impending foreclosure proceedings, initiated by the Willowbrook Ridge Homeowners Association against our property, citing the unpaid $319,000 combined balance. Ruby was still in her pajamas eating cereal when he knocked. Elena's hands trembled taking the paperwork, though her voice stayed steady enough for Ruby not to notice anything beyond a grown-up letter. I signed for the notice calmly, thanked the deputy, and closed the door. Then I called Harold Feynman before the deputy's car had even pulled out of our driveway. "This is the escalation point," Harold said carefully. "Once foreclosure paperwork is filed, we have grounds to intervene formally as Ridgeline Capital Partners, questioning the association's underlying authority to fine, assess, or foreclose at all." I asked him how long that intervention would take to prepare properly. "About 2 weeks," he said. Done right. 2 weeks felt like an eternity with foreclosure paperwork sitting on our kitchen counter. But I trusted Harold's caution more than my own anger. I spent those 2 weeks doing what I did best professionally, measuring, documenting, cross-referencing every board decision against the declaration's actual legal requirements, building an airtight case brick by brick. Vivian, unaware of what quietly moved beneath her, escalated publicly during those same 2 weeks, sending a neighborhood-wide newsletter naming our family specifically as an example of residents whose non-compliance threatens community property values, including our address, framing us as the villains in a story she'd authored from the very beginning. Neighbors who'd been distant grew colder still. Someone left an anonymous note in our mailbox suggesting we just sell and save everyone the trouble.
Ruby came home from school upset because a classmate repeated something her mother had.
I held Ruby that night longer than usual, promising her, without details she was too young to fully process, that everything happening wasn't her fault, and that sometimes the people who shout the loudest about rules are the ones breaking the biggest ones quietly, somewhere nobody's bothered to check yet. Denise reached out again during this period, increasingly nervous, telling me Vivian had started asking other board members pointed questions about my job, my finances, even my father, clearly sensing something didn't add up about a simple surveyor who wasn't crumbling the way her usual targets crumbled. "She's starting to worry," Denise admitted. "She doesn't know why yet, but she can feel it. You should know she's already talked to Ted about listing your property with Cross Creek's people directly after foreclosure. Like it's a foregone conclusion." I thanked Denise for the warning and told her the timeline was about to move fast. Harold filed our formal legal intervention on a Monday morning, citing Ridgeline Capital Partners' unextinguished declarant authority over the Willowbrook Ridge Homeowners Association. demanding immediate suspension of all foreclosure proceedings pending review of the association's underlying legal standing to fine or assess property owners in the first place. The filing named me, for the first time in any official capacity, not merely as a homeowner disputing a fine, but as the managing member of the very entity that held ultimate legal authority over the HOA's existence. Vivian received notice of the filing the same afternoon. According to Denise's account later, she read it twice. Denise told me over the phone that night, her voice carrying something close to disbelief. Then she asked me, out loud, in front of 2 other board members, "Who the hell is Ridgeline Capital Partners?" Nobody answered her. Nobody knew. I didn't respond publicly yet, letting the legal filing speak for itself while Harold requested a formal hearing before the county's civil division. Vivian, according to multiple accounts that trickled back to me over the following days, spent that week making frantic calls, trying to identify exactly who or what Ridgeline Capital Partners actually was. She eventually found the connection herself, digging through county records the same way I had, discovering my father's name attached to the original 1987 incorporation papers, and from there, tracing probate filings directly to me. According to Denise, the moment she connected the dots, she went completely silent for nearly an hour. Vivian showed up at our door 2 days later, alone, without Chauncey, wearing an expression I'd never seen from her before, something softer, more careful, clearly rehearsed. "I think there's been a misunderstanding between us," she said, as though she hadn't spent months trying to seize my family's home through manufactured violations. I let her stand on the porch a moment longer than necessary before responding, savoring, I'll admit, a version of the patience she'd once weaponized against me. "There's been a misunderstanding," I agreed calmly. "You believed rules only ever flowed downward, from you to everyone else. That was your mistake." She tried a different approach, softer still, mentioning how the fines could easily be reconsidered now that new information had come to light. How the special assessment might be administrative confusion, the board would happily correct. I told her I appreciated her honesty, though we both knew the word barely applied to her at all. "I'm not interested in quietly making this disappear," I told her, watching something flicker behind her composed expression. "I want to understand exactly how many families you did this to before us, and exactly how much of it traces back to Cross Creek Resorts and your husband's real estate deals." Vivian's face changed entirely at the mention of Cross Creek, the practiced softness dropping away like a mask slipping. "You have no idea what you're interfering with," she said, voice suddenly sharp, all pretense of apology abandoned. "That deal is worth millions to this entire neighborhood, whether people appreciate it or not." "Millions to you," I corrected quietly, "and to Ted, and to whichever board members you've quietly rewarded along the way. Not to the Petersons. Not to Walter Combs, signed into exhaustion and then bought out through shell companies with his name on them." She didn't deny it, more than any confession could have. She simply turned, walked back to her car, and drove away without another word, Chauncey's absence somehow making the retreat feel even colder, as if even her own dog had sensed something shifting that evening. Harold called an hour later, congratulating me on staying composed, though he warned me the fight was far from over. "Cornered people like her don't surrender," he said. They escalate, or they hide evidence, or both. Watch your back over the next few weeks. She still has resources and connections we don't fully understand yet. He was right to warn me. Someone attempted to access county records related to Ridgeline Capital Partners' original filings, according to the clerk's office, using credentials that turned out to belong, oddly, to Gary Pruitt, the same semi-retired inspector whose measurements had started this entire nightmare months earlier. Harold immediately filed a motion preserving all relevant county documents, preventing any possible tampering, while quietly noting Pruitt's attempted access as additional evidence of coordinated interference in an active legal matter. Vivian, it seemed, was scrambling to erase whatever paper trail she could reach before the hearing. Denise called again that week, more shaken than I'd ever heard her. She held an emergency board meeting, Denise said. Off the books. No public notice. She's telling everyone you're planning to seize the whole neighborhood, that you're some kind of predatory investor pretending to be a regular homeowner to steal everyone's property values. I asked Denise how the other board members reacted to that framing. 2 of them believed her completely, she said. The other 2 looked like they wanted to disappear into the carpet. Nobody asked why an actual predatory investor would spend 2 years living quietly on Larkspur Lane coaching soccer. Vivian's counter-narrative spread through the neighborhood faster than any truth could catch up with it, exactly as she'd designed her finds to spread months earlier. Suddenly, I wasn't the surveyor next door anymore. I was, according to whispered conversations at the community mailbox, some kind of secret land baron hiding his real agenda. Elena grew increasingly frustrated watching this unfold, wanting to correct the record publicly before Harold advised patience. Let the hearing correct it, he said. Anything you say now, out of order, out of context, she'll twist into ammunition. Save the truth for a room where it actually matters legally. I trusted his experience, though watching neighbors avoid eye contact at the bus stop tested that trust daily. Ruby, thankfully too young to fully grasp the shifting rumors, remained blissfully focused on her sunflowers, which had somehow survived every fine, every threat, every legal maneuver thrown against them so far. The county scheduled our civil hearing for 6 weeks out, standard timing for a case involving disputed declarant authority and formal foreclosure intervention. 6 weeks felt agonizingly long, especially with Vivian's counter-narrative gaining traction, but Harold insisted the delay actually worked in our favor, giving us time to build an overwhelming case. We used that time methodically, subpoenaing HOA financial records through Harold's formal legal channels, something Vivian had successfully stonewalled for years through vague claims of administrative backlog whenever ordinary homeowners requested them. Formal court authority, turned out, moved considerably faster than polite community association requests ever had. The financial records, once finally released, revealed discrepancies far beyond anything Denise had even suspected. HOA reserve funds meant for long-term infrastructure maintenance had been drawn down nearly 70% over 3 years, with withdrawals frequently timed suspiciously close to payments made to companies connected, once again, to Ted Hargrove's business network. Harold's forensic accountant, a meticulous woman named Priya Shah, flagged nearly $200,000 in reserve fund withdrawals categorized vaguely as consulting services or community improvement initiatives, with almost none of the promised improvements actually visible anywhere in Willowbrook Ridge's common areas. sidewalks, or clubhouse facilities. This isn't sloppy bookkeeping, Priya told us during a briefing at Harold's office. This is a pattern, draining this association's funds for years, using vague categories specifically designed to survive a casual audit, but not a forensic one. I thought of Denise's quiet warnings and felt something harden inside me. Around the same time, Walter Combs, the retired teacher whose mailbox fine had preceded a suspiciously convenient buyout, agreed to speak with Harold on the record, describing in detail how Vivian had personally pressured him to sell quickly, citing upcoming assessments he'd be unable to afford if he stayed. Walter's testimony matched the Peterson story almost exactly, down to the specific phrase, "You'll want to sell before things get expensive," suggesting Vivian used a rehearsed script whenever pressuring targeted families toward buyouts benefiting her husband's shell companies. Two families' accounts, independently given, now corroborated each other precisely. Harold filed a motion to consolidate our declarant authority hearing with a broader inquiry into HOA financial mismanagement, arguing the two issues were inseparable, both stemming from the same unchecked concentration of power Vivian had built over 11 unopposed years as board president. The judge granted the motion within days. Vivian's attorney, a nervous young associate clearly overwhelmed by the case's expanding scope, requested a continuance, citing insufficient time to review consolidated allegations. The judge denied it, noting that Vivian herself had controlled the timeline of every fine and assessment against my family without ever once granting similar patience. News of the consolidated hearing spread through Willowbrook Ridge differently than Vivian's earlier rumors had. This wasn't whispered gossip anymore. It was public court filings, accessible to anyone curious enough to look. And plenty of previously silent neighbors suddenly grew very curious indeed about numbers that had never quite added up. The Petersons, having already sold and moved 2 towns over, reached out to me directly after hearing about the case through a mutual friend. "We always suspected something was off," their message read, "but we didn't have proof, or the energy left to fight her after everything. We're glad someone finally can." Their willingness to testify, even after selling and moving on, added crucial weight to Harold's growing case, demonstrating a pattern stretching back years, not merely an isolated dispute between Vivian and one stubborn new homeowner she'd misjudged.
Harold called it the difference between an...
Meanwhile, Vivian doubled down publicly, hosting an emergency town hall at the clubhouse, framing herself as a victim of a hostile takeover attempt by a wealthy outsider using legal technicalities to seize community control. Attendance was high. Turned out, cuts both ways once real questions start circulating. I attended that town hall myself, quietly, near the back, watching her perform a version of righteous outrage I recognized instantly from months of experience. She painted herself as the last line of defense protecting ordinary families from a predatory land baron. Several attendees nodded along, exactly as she'd hoped they would, but something had shifted in the room compared to earlier meetings. A few hands went up with pointed questions about reserve fund withdrawals, about Ted Hargrove's LLCs, about why the clubhouse renovation promised 3 years ago still hadn't materialized despite documented payments for improvement initiatives nobody could actually locate anywhere on the property. Vivian deflected each question smoothly at first. Decades of practice steering meetings exactly where she wanted them to go. But Denise, finally done staying silent, stood up unprompted near the meeting's end and asked, calmly, whether the board planned to address the forged signatures on multiple prior meeting minutes. The room went completely silent. Vivian's composure cracked visibly for the first time in public, her mouth opening and closing without producing an immediate answer. "That's a serious accusation," she finally managed, voice tighter than usual. "One I'd be very careful making without proof," she added, an unmistakable threat beneath the words. "I have photographs of the blank signature pages," Denise said simply, no longer whispering, no longer glancing nervously toward exits. "I've had them for months. I was scared to say anything because I watched what happened to anyone who questioned you. I'm done being scared." The room stayed silent, but differently now. Vivian ended the town hall abruptly after that exchange, citing time constraints, though everyone present understood the real reason. "I left the clubhouse that night feeling, for the first time in months, that the tide beneath Willowbrook Ridge's placid surface had genuinely started turning, quietly but unmistakably, against her." Elena squeezed my hand walking to the car afterward. "You didn't say a single word in there," she noted. "I didn't need to," I told her. "The truth's been sitting in that clubhouse for years. It just needed enough people finally willing to look at it directly, instead of past it." Rattled by the town hall's turn against her, Vivian escalated far beyond anything she'd tried before, filing an emergency motion of her own, claiming Ridgeline Capital Partners' declarant authority had lapsed through abandonment over the decades, and demanding the court dismiss our entire intervention before the consolidated hearing could proceed. Harold expected this move and had already prepared for it, presenting the county's own recorded amendment history as proof that declarant authority remained legally intact. Precisely because none of the required signatures had ever been properly obtained, meaning abandonment simply couldn't apply to authority that was never validly transferred away. The judge, reviewing both filings, seemed unimpressed with Vivian's emergency motion, noting from the bench that a party cannot claim abandonment of rights they spent over a decade actively, if unknowingly, relying upon to enforce fines against homeowners. Vivian's attorney had no immediate response to that observation. Denied her dismissal, Vivian shifted tactics again, this time targeting Denise directly, calling an emergency board vote to remove her from her position, citing conduct unbecoming a board member for publicly discussing internal HOA matters without prior board authorization. The vote passed 3-1. Denise the lone dissenting voice against her own removal. Denise called me that night, her voice steady despite the day's events. "I expected it," she said. "Honestly, I'm relieved. I don't have to pretend to represent people I've watched her hurt for years anymore." I told her Harold would formally note her removal as retaliation for whistleblowing, adding further weight to our case. Vivian's retaliation against Denise backfired publicly almost immediately, several longtime residents openly criticizing the removal on the neighborhood's community forum, questioning why raising documented concerns about forged signatures warranted expulsion from a board supposedly meant to serve, not silence, its own membership. Sensing growing unrest, Vivian attempted damage control, announcing a voluntary independent audit of HOA finances, timed conveniently to occur after the consolidated hearing's evidence deadline. a maneuver Harold immediately flagged to the court as an obvious attempt to control narrative timing rather than genuinely pursue transparency. The judge agreed with Harold's characterization, ordering instead an immediate, court-supervised financial audit conducted by Priya Shah's team, with full, unrestricted access to HOA records, bank statements, and vendor contracts going back 7 years, far beyond whatever narrow window Vivian's proposed voluntary audit would have covered. Cornered legally, Vivian's public composure began fully unraveling. She sent a mass email to residents accusing me directly of manufacturing a legal conspiracy to seize community assets, attaching selectively edited excerpts from old emails I'd sent, stripped of context, designed to make my requests for documentation sound threatening. Harold advised against responding publicly to the email, again counseling patience, though it took genuine restraint to watch neighbors forward Vivian's distorted version of events without knowing the full picture yet. I trusted the process, reminding myself repeatedly that the consolidated hearing, not neighborhood gossip, would ultimately decide this. Elena wasn't nearly as patient watching Ruby come home upset again. This time because a classmate's parent had apparently called our family con artists within earshot of the kids. That night, for the first time, Elena asked whether we should consider selling and simply walking away from the entire mess. I understood the impulse completely, watching my daughter's confusion and hurt accumulate over something she had no part in creating. But something in me refused to let Vivian's manufactured chaos win. Not after everything the Petersons and Walter Combs had endured silently before us. We were closer to the truth than we'd ever been. If we walk away now, I told Elena, she gets exactly what she's always gotten. Someone else quietly disappearing so she can keep doing this to the next family, and the family after that. Elena sat with that for a long moment before nodding, tired but resolved to see it through with me. Priya's court-ordered audit, meanwhile, uncovered something even more damaging than the previous reserve fund discrepancies. Direct payments from HOA accounts to Cross Creek Resort's preliminary consulting arm, disguised as landscaping assessment fees, timed suspiciously close to each wave of fines issued against Creekside property owners like me. The financial trail effectively proved what Denise had suspected and I had theorized for months. Vivian wasn't merely enforcing overzealous rules out of personal control issues. She was actively, knowingly using HOA authority and funds to manufacture pretexts for devaluing and eventually seizing waterfront properties on Cross Creek's behalf. Priya's preliminary report went straight to Harold, and Harold, sensing the full weight of what they'd uncovered, requested an emergency evidentiary hearing ahead of the originally scheduled consolidated case, arguing that ongoing financial harm to homeowners justified immediate judicial intervention rather than waiting out the remaining weeks. The judge granted the emergency hearing, scheduling it just 10 days out, a timeline that sent Vivian's camp into visible disarray according to courthouse gossip Harold picked up from other attorneys. Cornered and desperate, Vivian made her most reckless move yet, one that would ultimately cost her everything. She attempted, through Gary Pruitt, to have new, updated survey markers quietly installed along my property line overnight, without notice, in a transparent last-ditch effort to physically alter the boundary evidence before the emergency hearing could examine it. My home security cameras, installed months earlier out of caution, caught the entire attempt on video. The footage showed Pruitt arriving after midnight, working by flashlight, driving new stakes roughly 9 feet onto my confirmed property line, exactly mirroring his earlier fraudulent measurements. Harold filed the footage immediately as evidence of active evidence tampering in an ongoing court matter, a move that changed the entire tenor of the case overnight. Pruitt, facing potential criminal charges for tampering with evidence in a civil proceeding, agreed to cooperate with investigators rather than face prosecution alone, providing a sworn statement detailing years of falsified inspection reports conducted at Vivian's direct request, always timed to support fines against properties bordering the creek. His statement named specific dates, specific properties, and specific fines, corroborating almost exactly the pattern Priya's financial audit had already independently uncovered. Two entirely separate investigative threads, one financial, one physical, now converged on the same undeniable conclusion. Vivian Hargrove had built her HOA presidency into a machine for land theft. News of Pruitt's cooperation reached Vivian before it became public record. According to Denise's remaining contacts on the board, and by all accounts, she reacted with something approaching panic, making frantic calls, reportedly threatening Pruitt directly, an act that only strengthened his resolve to fully cooperate with prosecutors instead. Desperate and cornered, Vivian made her most extreme move of the entire ordeal. She contacted Cross Creek Resorts directly, urging them to accelerate their rezoning application before the emergency hearing could potentially expose and unravel the entire arrangement, apparently hoping a completed deal might somehow insulate her from consequences already in motion. Cross Creek's legal team, upon learning about the active evidence tampering investigation and forensic financial audit, immediately distanced themselves from Vivian entirely, issuing a formal statement declaring they'd had no knowledge of any irregular practices, and were withdrawing their rezoning inquiry pending the outcome of ongoing legal proceedings. Watching Cross Creek publicly abandon her felt, according to Denise's account of a tense final board meeting, like watching Vivian's entire foundation crumble in real time. The very deal she'd risked everything to protect had evaporated the moment it became a liability rather than an asset to the people she'd hoped would shield her. Isolated now, with her development partner gone, her inspector cooperating with investigators, and a former board ally openly testifying against her, Vivian grew visibly erratic in her final public appearances before the emergency hearing, according to multiple neighbors who described her as short-tempered, defensive, unraveling in ways they'd never witnessed before. She showed up unannounced at Harold's office one afternoon, demanding to speak with me directly, bypassing every legal formality she'd previously insisted upon whenever I'd sought clarity from her. Harold refused to let her inside without proper representation present. A small irony given how often she denied me exactly that same courtesy. Standing in the parking lot instead, she tried one final appeal, her voice cracking in a way that almost sounded genuine. "I built this community," she said. "Everything I did was to protect its value, its future." I asked her, quietly, whether she'd tell that to Walter Combs, or the Petersons, or Ruby. She had no answer for that. Only anger, sharp and unguarded now that pretense no longer served any purpose. "You think you've won something," she spat. "But people like you always think that, right before it costs you everything." I told her I'd let the emergency hearing decide who exactly stood to lose everything. That confrontation, witnessed by two of Harold's paralegals through the office window, became its own small piece of evidence, corroborating the pattern of intimidation multiple. Homeowners had already described experiencing whenever they dared question her authority. Over the years she'd ruled Willowbrook Ridge unopposed and largely unaccountable. In the days before the emergency hearing, 3 more former homeowners came forward independently, having heard through the grapevine about Pruitt's cooperation and Denise's testimony, each describing remarkably similar patterns: manufactured violations, escalating fines, pressure to sell quickly, followed eventually by purchases traced back to Ted Hargrove's shell companies. Harold compiled all 7 now corroborated cases into a single, devastating timeline stretching back nearly 6 years, demonstrating conclusively that our family's ordeal wasn't an isolated dispute born from misunderstanding, but the latest iteration of a long-running scheme specifically targeting properties along Willowbrook Ridge's valuable creekside boundary. Priya's final audit report, delivered just 3 days before the hearing, confirmed nearly $400,000 in HOA funds diverted over 6 years through falsified consulting fees, unauthorized vendor payments, and reserve fund withdrawals never once reflected in actual community improvements anywhere within Willowbrook Ridge's common areas. Reading the final compiled case file the night before our hearing, Elena finally allowed herself something close to relief, the exhaustion of months finally giving way, however cautiously, to real hope. "She's not going to talk her way out of this one," Elena said quietly. I nodded, though I knew Vivian well enough by now not to underestimate her entirely. Vivian's legal team requested one final continuance the morning of the hearing. Citing newly discovered exculpatory evidence, they refused to specify in advance. The judge, already deeply skeptical given the pattern of delays and tampering attempts previously documented, denied the request outright, ordering proceedings to begin exactly as scheduled that morning. I arrived at the county courthouse early. Elena beside me, Harold and Priya already arranging documents at our table, Denise seated quietly in the gallery alongside, Walter Combs and representatives from 2 other affected families, all of them finally present together in one room after years of isolated, separate suffering. Vivian arrived late, visibly tense, Ted Hargrove trailing behind her looking equally strained, their usual polished composure noticeably absent under the weight of everything now converging against them simultaneously in front of a judge who had already grown openly impatient with their pattern of obstruction. The hearing opened with Harold presenting Ridgeline Capital Partners' unextinguished declarant authority, methodically walking the court through 14 invalid amendments, each missing the legally required signature that had never once been sought from either my father or myself across more than a decade of board actions. Vivian's attorney attempted to argue procedural technicalities, suggesting substantial compliance should satisfy the declaration's requirements even without the formal signature. But the judge pointed out, somewhat sharply, that substantial compliance couldn't retroactively excuse over a decade of enforcement actions against homeowners who'd had no meaningful avenue to challenge them. Priya took the stand next, walking through her forensic audit methodically, presenting spreadsheets and bank records showing the clear, unmistakable pattern of fund diversion toward entities connected to Ted Hargrove, always timed suspiciously close to enforcement actions against properties bordering the Cross Creek resorts had quietly targeted. Vivian's attorney's cross-examination attempts grew increasingly desperate, unable to meaningfully challenge documentation that simply existed, unambiguous and dated, regardless of how the questions were framed. Priya answered each attempt calmly, her testimony gaining rather than losing credibility with every failed attempt to undermine it. Gary Pruitt testified next, visibly nervous but resolute, describing in detail how Vivian had directed him to falsify survey measurements repeatedly over several years, always targeting the same handful of creekside properties, always timed to justify escalating fines that ultimately pressured owners toward selling far below fair market value. His account of the midnight survey stake tampering, corroborated directly by my home security footage, left little room for doubt. The judge reviewed the footage personally in the courtroom, watching Pruitt drive fraudulent stakes into my property under cover of darkness just days before this very hearing had been scheduled. Denise testified after Pruitt, her voice steady now in a way it never had been during those quiet, frightened phone calls months earlier, describing the blank signature pages, the falsified meeting minutes, and her own retaliatory removal from the board for daring to raise these concerns publicly at the town hall. Walter Combs and the two other affected homeowners testified in sequence, each account distinct in its details yet strikingly consistent in its underlying pattern, painting a comprehensive picture of systematic exploitation stretching back years before I'd ever purchased my home on Larkspur Lane. Unaware of the land's deeper history, by the time it came my turn to testify, the courtroom's atmosphere had shifted entirely from the tense uncertainty of the morning into something closer to grim, accumulated clarity. I walked the judge through my father's original Ridgeline filings, my own discovery process, and every fraudulent fine levied against my family. I described Ruby's tears over the sunflower garden, the pool suspension, the neighborhood rumors Vivian had personally seeded to isolate us socially even as she pursued foreclosure legally. I kept my voice measured throughout, letting the documented facts carry the emotional weight rather than performing outrage I genuinely felt. Under cross-examination, Vivian's attorney tried suggesting I'd deliberately concealed my Ridgeline connection to entrap her client, a theory the judge visibly dismissed, with a raised eyebrow, noting aloud that discovering an inheritance 8 months after a father's death hardly constituted a premeditated legal ambush against anyone.
11 years and full access to public county records. The judge observed dryly, to verify the very authority she claimed to exercise over this community. The burden of that oversight belongs to her, not to a homeowner who simply happened to inherit land she never bothered checking.
Vivian took the stand herself near the hearing's end, her earlier composure entirely gone, replaced by a brittle defensiveness that cracked further under Harold's methodical questioning. She initially denied knowledge of Pruitt's falsified surveys, a claim immediately undercut by financial records showing personal payments from her account to his. Pressed further about the diverted reserve funds, she pivoted to blaming poor bookkeeping practices from a previous treasurer, an explanation that collapsed entirely. Once Priya's report was re-referenced, showing the diversions continued for years after that treasurer had left the board and Vivian alone controlled financial approvals. Finally, asked directly about Cross Creek Resort's involvement, Vivian's composure broke completely. Every board president makes deals to benefit the community, she snapped, momentarily losing the careful control she'd maintained for over a decade.
Nobody complains when property values.
Harold's follow-up landed with quiet, devastating precision. MS. Whose property values went up? Yours? C's? Or the families you find into selling their homes at a fraction of what they were worth? Vivian had no answer, her silence in that courtroom louder than any testimony given that day. The judge called a brief recess after Vivian's testimony, and I stepped outside the courtroom to find Elena crying quietly in the hallway. Not from sadness this time, but from something like exhausted, disbelieving relief, watching months of quiet suffering finally being named plainly, in a room that mattered. Denise found us in that hallway too, her own eyes wet, thanking me for believing her whispered warnings enough to build a case that finally gave her, and Walter, and everyone else Vivian had harmed, a legitimate forum to be heard after years of feeling powerless against a system built entirely to protect her. Walter Combs shook my hand firmly, telling me he'd almost given up hope of ever seeing any accountability after selling his home years earlier at a devastating loss. "You didn't just fight for your own family," he said. "You gave the rest of us our story back too." I didn't have words adequate to that. When the recess ended, the judge returned to the bench with an expression that suggested her decision, while not yet formally announced, had already crystallized firmly against Vivian's defense, based on the sheer weight and consistency of evidence presented across financial records, tampered surveys, and multiple independent witness accounts. Ted Hargrove, watching his wife's testimony unravel from the gallery, left the courtroom abruptly before final arguments even began, his expression suggesting he understood, perhaps before Vivian herself fully did, exactly how thoroughly their carefully constructed scheme had just collapsed in front of an entire community they'd spent years exploiting. Final arguments stretched into late afternoon, Harold methodically summarizing 7 years of documented harm, invalid legal authority, and deliberate fraud, while Vivian's attorney, visibly deflated, offered little beyond procedural technicalities that had already been thoroughly and repeatedly dismantled throughout the day's testimony and evidence presentation. The judge announced she would issue a written ruling within 1 week. Given the case's complexity and the sheer volume of evidence requiring careful documentation in her decision, but noted from the bench, unusually candidly, that the emergency relief requested regarding foreclosure would be granted immediately, effective that same day. Walking out of the courthouse that evening, Elena and I stood together in the parking lot for a long moment, saying nothing, just breathing air that finally felt lighter than it had in months. Ruby, waiting with my sister at home, had no idea yet how much had shifted that single afternoon. Denise hugged us both before driving home, promising to keep us updated on any lingering board gossip, though she suspected, correctly as it turned out, that whatever remained of Vivian's board would collapse entirely within days once formal word of the hearing's outcome spread through Willowbrook Ridge's tightly wound grapevine. That night, for the first time in months, Ruby slept without either of us checking on her twice out of anxious habit. Elena and I sat on our back porch instead, looking out over the creek, over the very land Vivian had tried so hard to seize, feeling something like ownership again. Finally, fully. The following morning brought a flurry of calls from other Willowbrook Ridge residents, some apologetic for believing Vivian's rumors, others simply curious, all of them clearly sensing that whatever quiet authority she'd wielded for over a decade had evaporated entirely somewhere inside that courtroom the previous afternoon. I didn't gloat, though I won't pretend some part of me didn't want to. Instead, I focused on what mattered more formally, legally, exercising Ridgeline Capital Partners' declarant authority to begin dissolving the compromised board entirely, replacing it with an interim structure focused on transparency rather than personal enrichment. Harold drafted the formal notice within days, citing the court's emergency ruling as grounds for immediate board dissolution under the declaration's original terms. Terms that had sat dormant and unenforced for over a decade simply because nobody, including Vivian herself, had ever bothered checking whether she truly held the authority she'd claimed. The notice went out to every Willowbrook Ridge homeowner, explaining plainly, without embellishment, exactly what had been uncovered: falsified surveys, diverted funds, forged signatures, and a pattern of manufactured violations designed to pressure specific families into selling undervalued waterfront property to a resort developer working alongside Vivian's own husband. Reactions poured in rapidly, a mixture of shock, anger, and, from a surprising number of residents, quiet relief that the strange, suffocating control Vivian had exercised over the neighborhood for years finally had an explanation beyond simple personality. One that made sense of dues increases and unexplained fines many had simply endured silently. Several neighbors reached out directly, apologizing specifically for the cold shoulders and whispered judgments during the months our family had been publicly branded troublemakers. I accepted each apology graciously, understanding that Vivian's narrative machine had worked on all of us, in different ways, for different reasons, over many years. Ted Hargrove, facing his own mounting legal exposure tied to the shell companies and Cross Creek dealings, quietly filed for separation from Vivian within the same week the dissolution notice went out, a detail that spread through the neighborhood almost as quickly as news of the courtroom hearing itself had. Vivian herself went silent publicly. No more newsletters, no more emergency town halls. Her once constant presence at community events and the mailbox simply vanishing overnight, replaced by an eerie quiet that felt, to those of us who'd endured her scrutiny for years, both unsettling and deeply satisfying in equal measure. The interim board, formed under Ridgeline's restored declarant authority, included Denise as chair, alongside Walter Combs and two newly elected residents committed explicitly to financial transparency, reduced enforcement overreach, and a full independent review of every fine issued under Vivian's presidency going back the full 6 years Priya's audit covered. That review, completed over the following 2 months, resulted in the reversal of over 60 individual fines across the neighborhood, totaling nearly $1,100,000 in wrongful assessments, most either refunded directly or applied as credit against future dues for families still living in Willowbrook Ridge. My own family's $319,000 combined fine and assessment was formally voided in its entirety, the lien against our property released, and the pool suspension permanently struck from any record, though Ruby, by then, had mostly forgotten the incident entirely, absorbed instead in a new soccer season. Gary Pruitt, cooperating fully with both civil proceedings and a subsequent county investigation into professional misconduct, lost his inspection license permanently, though prosecutors, citing his substantial cooperation, agreed to a plea arrangement avoiding jail time in exchange for continued testimony against Vivian in any related criminal proceedings. The county attorney's office, alerted by the civil case's findings, opened a separate criminal investigation into potential fraud and embezzlement charges against Vivian Hargrove directly, examining specifically the diverted HOA funds and their connection to Cross Creek Resort's now abandoned rezoning inquiry along the creek. Vivian's formal deposition in that criminal investigation, conducted weeks later, finally forced the full, unguarded truth into the open, stripped entirely of the community-minded language she'd hidden behind for over a decade. Investigators pressed her methodically, and piece by piece, her carefully maintained composure disintegrated under direct, unavoidable questioning. She admitted, eventually, to directing Pruitt's falsified surveys personally, describing it almost clinically, as though the human families affected had simply been obstacles in a spreadsheet rather than people whose homes and sense of security she'd deliberately, repeatedly undermined for personal and financial gain across multiple years. She admitted to diverting reserve funds toward Cross Creek's preliminary consulting fees, framing it, even then, as an investment in the neighborhood's future rather than outright theft, a rationalization the investigating attorney reportedly found almost more disturbing than an outright confession of pure greed would have been. When asked directly about the forged board signatures Denise had photographed, Vivian initially deflected, then finally admitted to keeping blank signature pages specifically for situations requiring unanimous appearance on contentious votes, effectively confirming, in her own words, exactly the fraud Denise had risked everything to expose months earlier. The most damning admission came almost incidentally, when investigators asked why she'd specifically targeted Creekside properties rather than enforcing violations uniformly across the entire neighborhood. Because that's where the value was, she said simply, momentarily forgetting, seemed, that admitting motive this plainly constituted a confession in itself. That single sentence, quoted directly in the subsequent indictment, became something of a grim shorthand throughout the neighborhood for everything Vivian's reign had ultimately represented. Not community stewardship, not neighborhood values, but a cold, calculated pursuit of value extraction dressed up in the language of order and compliance. Formal criminal charges followed within weeks. Multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, forgery, and conspiracy to commit extortion. The last charge tied specifically to the pattern of manufactured fines designed to pressure homeowners into distressed sales benefiting entities connected to her husband and Cross Creek resorts. Vivian's attorney negotiated an initial plea deal covering some, though not all, of the charges, an arrangement Harold explained to us as fairly typical given the complexity of prosecuting years of interconnected financial fraud. Though the deal still required significant restitution and a lengthy probationary period with strict financial reporting requirements. The restitution amount, once finalized, totaled just over $1.1 million, covering diverted HOA funds, reversed fraudulent fines, and legal costs incurred by affected homeowners throughout the entire ordeal, a figure that felt, to those of us who'd lived through it, both enormous and somehow still insufficient. Vivian sold her own home within months of the plea agreement, needing the proceeds to satisfy her restitution obligations, moving out of Willowbrook Ridge entirely under circumstances almost perfectly mirroring the forced, distressed sales she'd once orchestrated against families like the Petersons and Walter Combs across so many quiet, unnoticed years. I felt, watching the moving truck pull away from her old house one gray Tuesday morning, less triumph than I'd expected, and more a kind of tired, sober relief, the specific satisfaction of watching a genuinely dangerous pattern finally, conclusively broken rather than simply moved somewhere else to repeat itself. Denise, elected permanently as HOA president in the community's first fully transparent election in over a decade, implemented sweeping reforms almost immediately, public financial reporting, rotating board terms, mandatory third-party audits every 2 years, and strict, clearly defined procedures for any future fines or assessments against residents. Walter Combs, though he'd already moved away years earlier, received a formal written apology from the new board alongside his portion of the restitution funds, a gesture he told me meant more than the money itself, finally providing acknowledgement for an injustice he'd quietly carried, largely unspoken, for years. The Petersons, likewise, received restitution and a formal apology. Though they'd already resettled comfortably elsewhere by then. Their only real regret, they told me over coffee one afternoon, was not having had the resources or support system to fight back the way our family eventually had. Together, Ruby's sunflowers, still standing untouched behind our fence, bloomed spectacularly that entire summer, oversized and golden, as though entirely unaware they'd once been. Cited as a hazardous unpermitted agricultural structure, worth $12,000 in restoration fees under an authority that had never legitimately existed at all. Elena planted a second garden bed that season. This one dedicated specifically to Ruby's choice of flowers. Quiet, deliberate act of reclaiming joy in the exact space that had once been weaponized against our family, turning what Vivian intended as a battleground back into simply, plainly, the family's backyard again. I formally restructured Ridgeline Capital Partners' role going forward, working with Harold and the new transparent HOA board to permanently, explicitly transfer full declarant authority to the Homeowners Association through proper legal channels this time, closing the exact loophole Vivian had unknowingly relied upon for over a decade of unchecked control. That transfer included binding provisions preventing any future board from unilaterally imposing assessments beyond a clearly defined threshold without a full homeowner vote.
A safeguard designed specifically to prevent any future Vivian Hargrove from ever again accumulating the kind of unchecked, unaccountable power she'd wielded across Willowbrook Ridge for so long.
Cross Creek Resorts, publicly distancing themselves throughout the entire fallout, quietly abandoned any remaining interest in the Creekside land entirely. Their brief, opportunistic partnership with Vivian ultimately costing them more in reputational damage than whatever profit the original rezoning scheme might have theoretically generated for their company. Gary Pruitt's cooperation, in the end, proved instrumental not just in our specific case, but in a broader county review of his prior inspection work, uncovering 2 additional, unrelated instances of falsified reports affecting different neighborhoods entirely, expanding accountability well beyond Willowbrook Ridge's own specific, painful history. Ted Hargrove's real estate license came under formal review by the state board following revelations about his shell company's involvement in the scheme, a process that concluded, eventually, with a lengthy suspension and mandatory restitution contributions toward the broader settlement affecting Willowbrook Ridge's defrauded homeowners. I ran into Vivian only once more, months later, at a grocery store 2 towns over, near wherever she'd relocated after selling her house. She looked smaller somehow, stripped of the confidence that had once filled entire clubhouse meetings, pushing a cart quietly down an aisle, avoiding eye contact entirely. I didn't approach her, didn't feel the need for any dramatic final confrontation. Everything that needed saying had already been said, in a courtroom, through documented evidence, through the voices of every family she'd once dismissed as powerless obstacles standing between her and whatever value she believed she was entitled to extract. Ruby, now a year older, barely remembers the specifics of that difficult period, mostly recalling instead the summer her sunflowers grew taller than Daddy, a small, innocent mercy that let her childhood memory settle on wonder rather than fear, exactly the outcome Elena and I had fought so hard to protect. Denise and I remain close, her leadership steering Willowbrook Ridge into something genuinely resembling the community it always claimed to be on paper. Before one person's quiet, decade-long accumulation of unchecked authority turned neighborhood values into a euphemism for whatever benefited her personally, at everyone else's steadily accumulating expense. Looking back across the entire ordeal, I keep returning to one particular moment. Standing in our driveway that first week, watching Vivian measure my mailbox with a tape measure, already deciding, based on nothing but my work boots and my quiet, unassuming manner, exactly how little resistance she expected from me. She never once considered that quiet, unassuming people sometimes carry entire histories she couldn't see, buried in old manila folders in a garage, waiting patiently to surface exactly when needed most. She built an entire kingdom on the assumption that authority, once claimed loudly enough, simply becomes real through repetition. What she never understood, until it was far too late to matter, was that real authority requires actual legal standing beneath it, standing she'd never once bothered verifying across 11 years of increasingly reckless fines, assessments, and manufactured violations against families who deserved so much better than what she gave them. My father, I think, would have found some quiet, wry satisfaction in how this all unfolded, watching land he developed decades earlier ultimately protect his son's family from exactly the kind of small-scale tyranny he'd probably witnessed plenty of times himself across a long career navigating property disputes and development politics. I never did discover exactly why he held on to Ridgeline's declarant rights instead of formally transferring them, whether it was oversight, sentiment, or some quiet, deliberate instinct toward caution he never fully explained to anyone before he passed. Whatever the reason, that unfinished paperwork became our family's unexpected shield. Harold, wrapping up the final administrative details months later, joked that our case would probably become a teaching example in future law school seminars on HOA governance and declarant rights, a strange legacy for what started as nothing more than a fence, a garden, and 8 defiant, golden sunflowers. Elena and I still walk that creek most evenings now. The same water Vivian once wanted developed into a resort, watching it move quietly past exactly as it probably has for centuries, indifferent entirely to whichever human schemes briefly tried claiming ownership over its gentle, persistent, unhurried current. Ruby asked me recently, almost offhandedly, why Vivian had been so mean about a garden. I told her, as simply as I could manage, that some people mistake small amounts of power for permission to hurt others, and that the bravest thing anyone can do is refuse to accept that mistake quietly. She nodded, satisfied with that answer in the specific, uncomplicated way children accept explanations before returning immediately to whatever mattered more in that particular moment. In this case, whether her sunflowers might grow even taller next summer than they had this year, already planning improvements to her garden bed. I think often about Denise's quiet courage, how she carried evidence of wrongdoing for months, terrified, before finally speaking plainly in that clubhouse meeting, understanding that silence, however protective it feels individually, ultimately allows exactly the kind of harm she witnessed to continue spreading, unchecked, toward the next family, and the next. Walter Combs sends a card every year now, around the anniversary of the final court ruling. Simple, brief notes thanking us again for pursuing accountability he'd long since given up expecting. A small, steady reminder that fighting quiet injustices sometimes matters most for people who've already stopped hoping anyone ever will. The Petersons visited last summer, finally able to see Willowbrook Ridge again without the specific dread they'd carried during their final months living there, remarking how strange it felt walking familiar streets that finally, genuinely belonged to the people living on them, rather than to whoever controlled the paperwork behind the scenes. I sold my father's old Ridgeline folder to nobody, obviously, but I did finally scan every document properly, storing digital copies securely, understanding now exactly how much quiet power sits dormant in paperwork most people never think to question, filed away in county offices, waiting for someone patient enough to look. Priya's forensic audit skills, so instrumental throughout our case, eventually led her to a permanent position reviewing HOA financial practices across the broader county. A small, unplanned ripple effect from our specific fight extending protections toward neighborhoods we'd never even visited, facing problems eerily similar to our own. Gary Pruitt, having lost his license and his reputation, still occasionally sends herald updates on his ongoing cooperation with the broader county investigation, seemingly determined to make some meaningful amends for years spent falsifying reports that harmed families who'd trusted his supposedly neutral, professional judgment without ever questioning it. Cross Creek Resorts eventually developed a different, unrelated property 2 counties over, their name occasionally appearing in local news for entirely unconnected reasons now. The creek behind our house remaining exactly as it always had been. Quiet, unremarkable, blessedly free of whatever resort ambitions once threatened to reshape it entirely. Ted Hargrove relocated out of state after his license suspension concluded, according to occasional second-hand updates from neighbors who still track that particular chapter of Willowbrook Ridge's history with the kind of grim fascination reserved for genuinely dramatic local scandals nobody quite expected in such an otherwise ordinary community. I think, sometimes, about how differently everything might have unfolded had I not opened that manila folder the night after Ruby's pool humiliation. How close we came to simply paying escalating fines indefinitely, never discovering the buried authority sitting quietly in our own garage the entire time we suffered. That thought unsettles me more than almost anything else from that entire period. The fragile, almost accidental nature of justice sometimes, dependent on a single overlooked folder, a single willing whistleblower, a single security camera catching exactly the wrong person doing exactly the wrong thing at precisely the wrong moment. Denise tells me the new board occasionally reviews our case during onboarding for incoming members, less as a cautionary tale about any specific person, and more as a broader lesson about how easily concentrated, unchecked authority can quietly calcify into exploitation when nobody bothers regularly verifying the legitimacy behind it. Elena and I never did move away from Larkspur Lane, despite everything, deciding instead that the house, the creek, and yes, even Ruby's stubborn, thriving sunflowers, had become worth defending rather than abandoning. A small act of reclamation neither of us regrets, even on the difficult days that occasionally still surface. I still measure boundaries professionally, the same careful, patient work I did before any of this began, though I approach every property line now with a slightly different awareness, understanding intimately how easily boundaries, physical and legal both, can be quietly manipulated by anyone confident enough nobody will ever check closely. Ruby's soccer team made the regional finals last spring, an entirely unrelated victory that nonetheless felt, to Elena and me, like some small, cosmic acknowledgement that ordinary joys had finally, fully returned to our family's daily life, no longer overshadowed by legal filings, certified letters, or quietly accumulating dread. Harold retired not long after our case concluded, telling me once, over a final celebratory dinner, that ours was among the most satisfying cases of his entire career. Precisely because it ended not merely in financial restitution, but in genuine, structural change protecting an entire community going forward. Not just our family alone. I keep a single frame document in my home office now. Not the final court ruling, but the original 1987 Ridgeline Incorporation paper my father filed. A quiet reminder of how patience, documentation, and a stubborn refusal to accept manufactured authority eventually, inevitably exposed exactly how fragile that authority actually was. Vivian Hargrove's name still occasionally surfaces in county court records. Ongoing restitution payments, updated financial disclosures required under her probation terms, small administrative footnotes to what once felt, during those exhausting months, like an unstoppable, all-powerful force determined to take everything our family had worked to build. I've come to understand that people like Vivian rarely see themselves as villains while it's happening, convinced instead that their accumulated small cruelties serve some greater, justified purpose, whether protecting community values or simply protecting their own sense of control over a world they've decided they alone understand correctly. That understanding doesn't excuse what she did. Not remotely, but it helps explain why so many neighbors initially believed her narrative so readily. Why authority, confidently claimed and rarely questioned, so easily convinces people around it, right up until someone finally, patiently, insists on checking the actual paperwork underneath. Ruby still tends her garden every spring. The sunflowers now something of a small neighborhood tradition. Other families occasionally stopping by our fence, lined to admire them, an unplanned, gentle irony given how close those same flowers once came to being legally, forcibly torn from the ground entirely. Elena jokes sometimes that we should frame Vivian's original certified letter alongside my father's incorporation papers, two documents representing opposite ends of the exact same story. One attempting to claim authority that was never truly hers, the other quietly, patiently proving authority she never even realized we already held. I declined the joke, gently, telling Elena I'd rather not keep reminders of that specific fear displayed prominently in our home, preferring instead to let the sunflowers themselves stand as the only monument this particular chapter of our lives really needed. Alive, growing, entirely unbothered by whatever fought to uproot them. Denise's leadership continues strengthening Willowbrook Ridge's community trust year over year. Annual transparent budget meetings now drawing genuine, engaged attendance rather than the resigned, sparse crowds Vivian's presidency once produced, Residents finally believing, again, that their voices and questions actually mattered within their own neighborhood governance. Walter Combs eventually moved back to town, purchasing a small condo not far from Willowbrook Ridge, telling me over coffee that watching accountability finally arrive, even years later, gave him enough renewed faith in the process to feel comfortable living nearby again, something he hadn't expected to feel again. The Petersons, similarly, mentioned considering a return to the area someday, though for now they remained happily settled elsewhere, content simply knowing the specific injustice they'd quietly endured had ultimately, formally, been named and addressed, even if reclaiming their old home itself no longer felt necessary or desired. I think about Ridgeline Capital Partners now mostly in the past tense. Its declarant authority formally, permanently transferred to the community itself. Exactly the outcome my father probably always intended, however delayed by circumstance, illness, and an unfinished stack of paperwork that ultimately protected far more than any of us initially realized. Priya still occasionally consults for Willowbrook Ridge's new board, a light, ongoing arrangement ensuring the kind of financial transparency that should have existed from the very beginning, a small, structural safeguard against any future leader ever again mistaking quiet community trust for an invitation toward unchecked personal enrichment. Ruby, older now, occasionally asks sharp, surprisingly perceptive questions about that period, understanding gradually, in age-appropriate pieces, exactly what her parents fought to protect, and why standing firm against manufactured authority sometimes matters more than simply avoiding the exhausting, uncomfortable difficulty of an extended fight. Elena and I try answering those questions honestly, without dramatizing or minimizing what happened, hoping she grows up understanding both the real danger unchecked power poses, and the equally real, quiet strength patient documentation, careful evidence, and stubborn refusal to simply comply can eventually, reliably provide against it. I still think, sometimes, about the version of this story where I never opened my father's folder, where Vivian's fines simply escalated indefinitely, where we eventually sold, exhausted and defeated, joining Walter Combs and the Petersons among her quiet list of forced, undervalued sales benefiting entities connected to her husband. That alternate version unsettles me precisely because it required so little to occur. Just a slightly less curious evening, a slightly more exhausted decision, to simply pay whatever she demanded rather than dig deeper into old paperwork gathering dust in a garage nobody had bothered organizing properly in months. Harold once told me, near the case's conclusion, that most people facing exactly our situation never discover whatever quiet leverage might theoretically exist somewhere in their own history, simply because exhaustion, fear, and the sheer administrative difficulty of fighting back overwhelm curiosity long before any hidden advantage gets uncovered. That observation stayed with me longer than almost anything else from the entire ordeal. Quiet, sobering reminder of how much injustice likely persists unchallenged simply because most people, understandably, lack either the resources, the time, or the specific stubborn curiosity required to dig deep enough to find their own version of Ridgeline. I've since spoken, informally, with a few other families facing similarly overzealous HOA enforcement in neighboring communities, sharing what little practical advice I can offer. Request original founding documents. Verify declarant transfers. document everything meticulously, and never assume claimed authority automatically equals legitimate, legally verified authority. Denise jokes that I've become something of an accidental local celebrity among homeowners' rights advocates, a label I accept somewhat reluctantly, preferring instead to think of myself simply as someone lucky enough to stumble onto exactly the right buried paperwork at exactly the moment my family needed it most. Ruby's sunflowers, entering their third full season now, have become tall enough that Ruby herself jokes about needing a ladder to properly tend the highest blooms. A small, ongoing family joke that carries, beneath its lightness, the quiet satisfaction of watching something once threatened simply continue, stubbornly, to thrive. Elena returned to teaching part-time last fall, something she'd paused during the most stressful months of our case, telling me the classroom finally felt like a place she could fully focus again, rather than constantly, anxiously monitoring the mailbox for whatever new certified letter Vivian's board might send next. I still occasionally drive past Vivian's old house, now owned by a young family with 2 small children who have no idea, presumably, about the specific history embedded in that particular property. The fines, the forged signatures, the quiet, calculated scheme that once nearly cost our family everything we'd built. That anonymity feels appropriate somehow. The house itself entirely blameless. Simply a structure that happened to shelter someone who mistook temporary, unverified authority for permanent, unquestionable power, learning eventually, painfully, exactly how quickly that illusion collapses once someone finally, patiently, checks the actual paperwork underneath it all. Ruby occasionally reminds me, unprompted, that her sunflowers are the strongest flowers in the whole neighborhood. A simple, joyful claim I never correct, understanding she's not entirely wrong. Those particular flowers having survived considerably more than ordinary garden pests or unpredictable weather ever could have thrown against them. Looking back now, months removed from the hearing's final resolution, I recognize the entire ordeal less as a story about property lines or legal technicalities, and more as a story about what happens when quiet, patient people finally, deliberately refuse to accept manufactured authority simply because it arrives wrapped in official-sounding language. The formal restitution payments continue arriving on schedule, modest monthly installments that will, according to Harold's calculations, fully satisfy the court-ordered amount. Within another 2 years, a slow, steady, bureaucratic conclusion to what once felt like an unstoppable, existential threat against everything our family had built together. Willowbrook Ridge itself feels different now. Walking through it most mornings, dues modest and clearly explained, fines rare and thoroughly documented, neighbors greeting each other again with the kind of easy familiarity that existed, presumably, before one person's quiet accumulation of unchecked authority slowly poisoned that trust for everyone. Denise's transparent leadership, Priya's ongoing financial oversight, and the community's collectively hard-won skepticism toward unchecked authority have combined into something genuinely resembling the neighborhood Willowbrook Ridge's original developers. My own father among them, probably imagined when they first platted these quiet, creekside streets decades ago. I think my father would recognize this version of the neighborhood far more readily than the one Vivian built during her 11 unopposed years. A place where authority answers to documented, verifiable legitimacy rather than simply confident repetition. where families grow gardens without fear, and boundaries mean exactly what they're recorded to mean. Elena and I sat on our porch again last week, watching Ruby chase fireflies near her sunflower bed, the creek moving quietly beyond the fence line, and neither of us said much, simply sharing the specific, hard-won quiet of a family finally, fully at rest in a home that genuinely belongs to them. Whatever comes next for Willowbrook Ridge, I trust it more now, not because I believe abuse of power can never happen again, but because we've collectively learned exactly how it happens, quietly, gradually, through unchecked authority nobody bothered verifying, and exactly what it takes to finally, thoroughly dismantle it. Vivian Hargrove taught me, unintentionally, something I never expected to learn from a woman who once fined my family $350,000 over a garden fence. That real authority requires real accountability, and that anyone confident enough to skip that step is eventually, inevitably, going to meet someone patient enough to check. My father's old folder still sits in my home office now, no longer hidden, no longer forgotten, a quiet reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing anyone can hold isn't wealth or title, but simply patience, documentation, and the stubborn refusal to accept manufactured authority as something automatically, unquestionably real. Ruby's sunflowers bloom again every summer, taller each year, rooted exactly where Vivian once tried, and failed, to tear them out, standing now as the only monument this entire ordeal really needed. Quiet, golden, thriving, utterly unbothered by whatever briefly, desperately tried to claim otherwise.